Right, we're live now, so let's get started then. So, hi everyone, my name's Madeline Dyer and I'm a YA fiction writer and personal essayist. I'm joined today by Sue William Silverman, the author of this essay collection here, and I have my copy right here. Oh, just trying to find the camera. So, this collection is How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. We're going to be discussing the personal essay as a literary form. We'll be discussing our own work and where we get our ideas from. We'll also be ending this live video with a brief reading as well from Sue. So you'll get to hear her reading a passage from her new book, and this book is amazing. I've already read it, so I highly recommend it. Now, this is a live video stream to YouTube, so if you're watching live and you want to ask a question to either Sue or I, all you need to do is leave a comment on the live chat function. And so long as I've configured everything correctly, your question should then appear on the screen with Sue and I, and we'll be able to answer it live. So this is a great opportunity to really engage in the Q&A. So welcome, Sue. Firstly, do you want to tell everyone watching a bit about you and what this book is about?
Yes. Hi, it's really nice to see you here live, and thank you so much for doing this. So my new book is How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, and it is a memoir in essay form. So it explores both my fear of death, trying to confront the fear, as well as my desire to run away from it, to sort of flee it. And but the book is not as sort of doom and gloomy as it might sound, because I also use a lot of sort of irony and gallows humor as well, to kind of so it doesn't sound just too dark. The basic premise is that I, as narrator, it opens with me sort of cruising this really industry blighted High Route 17 in New Jersey. And so the structure is kind of like a road trip, but it's a road trip through memory. And as I'm kind of when I'm on this metaphorical road trip, I am kind of collecting memories and curating the memories, kind of with the idea that if I personally can't physically survive death, although I really do want to survive death, but if I can't, then it's kind of like that the memories are immortalized. So as a writer, if I'm writing my memories and collecting them and curating them and trying to understand them, then that those memories will survive. So I think that sort of in short is for anybody who wants to survive, think about collecting your memories and writing them down.
Yeah, I definitely get that feeling from having read your book. Like, a lot of it is very sort of centered on memories, and it's a really interesting read. I see we've got a question from Essie Anderson. So she has asked, how did you come up with that title? It's brilliant. So yeah, how did you come up with it?
Well, it's not I had a working title, and it really bugs me because I could not remember what the working title was. But sort of over time, the more that I wrote in the book, and the more I really understood what the theme of the book was, that it is about trying to survive physical death. But the more I wrote, I also realized that the book was also about kind of surviving more emotional and spiritual deaths as well. Things like, addiction or illness, divorce, sexual assault. And so in that sense, it's also kind of about how to survive life. So it's just sort of about the idea of survival, but I did want a title that would sound sort of ironic, that like if I just called it, I don't ever want to die or something. I mean, that's just sort of like boring and sort of like prescriptive. So I wanted a title that would convey the irony of the book, and to kind of open it up, like the part and other inconveniences, to sort of open it up to be more than just trying to physically survive death. But it just sort of came to me, probably like years into the writing project. But I'm glad that you liked the title. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very attention-grabbing title because, yeah, when I first came
Yeah.
across your book, that was the thing that really stood out to me, and it made me intrigued. And when I then looked it up and found, yeah, I need to read this, and I'm so glad that I did read it. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, so I'm very excited by your work, and well, I'm sure you know that because I think this is the third time we've chatted recently. Um, I also write personal
Yes,
essays,
I know.
and yeah, I'm working on a memoir. And you've already helped me so much with working out exactly what I want to say. Because we had that Twitter chat a couple of weeks ago, and
Exactly. Right.
yeah, your comments on writing memoir were just so insightful and really helpful from like a writer and craft point of view. I remember
Thank
last
you.
time when we chatted then, about your writing process for this book. You mentioned that the first draft probably took you about a year or so to write. And one of the things in particular that you said that has resonated with me so much was you said it is so difficult to go deep inside and explore the heart. Memoir is not just about writing the surface story of events, it's really about writing the story behind the story, and discovering that can take time. And I just love that. And I keep thinking about that all the time because it's just so, it's just so real, and that is very much about uh, what the process of writing memoir is. And well, personal essays and memoirs are really both about discovery. So when you were writing this essay collection, did you discover anything unexpected about yourself?
Yes, and, really to go back to, S.E. Anderson's question, what I did discover was that the book, was well, first, when I first began, I was writing essays, and I thought they were just gonna be standalone. So it was about a year in before I did realize that, oh, I mean, I always knew that I was scared of death, but I'd never written about it. And so I realized, oh, these essays really are kind of highlighting this fear of death. And so this is what the theme is going to be. But the longer, maybe than another year or so into the process, that's when I came to realize that it was also about um, surviving these sort of spiritual and emotional forms of death as well. But so I was really, so the idea that I was looking at death in this very kind of broad frame, that is certainly one thing that I discovered. Um, what I think I came to understand in a different way. So by writing this memoir in essay form, it's kind of like turning the lens of a camera in some ways, so that each essay kind of highlights or conveys sort of a different form of death or fear, so that it can be kind of wide open when you're working kind of in these essay forms. So that, I mean, every essay sort of has to touch the theme of some form of death, but but that's a wide range. And for example, there's one essay in the book that's about my obsession with the singer Adam Lambert. And I know that we have some people from Great Britain here, and I don't know if you know of Adam Lambert, but he was on our show, American show, American Idol, and now he fronts the band Queen. But anyway, I'm majorly obsessed with him, and the reason why is because he reminds me of sort of my when I was like this hippie chick, like years ago. So he reminds me of my desire not to grow old and not to die. And he sort of brings me back to a younger self. So there's an essay about him. At the same time, there's another essay and about this or cannibal Jeffrey Dahmer, who I don't know if y'all have heard of him, but he was just a really, eventually he got caught. And clearly that has to do with my fear of death too. But I was kind of obsessed with him uh, at a time when I was just going into rehab for a sex addiction and an eating disorder. Now, these two people are totally dissimilar. I mean, a singer and a cannibal, right? They're totally dissimilar. But yet, in an essay collection, I was able to explore them and how they intersected with my own fear of death. And so it was all kind of a learning process about how I could sort of pull these seemingly disparate events or people or things together into one book and kind of make it work, make it sort of hold together as an essay collection. So the whole thing was kind of a learning process in that way.
That's really interesting because, like when I was reading through your essay collection, I was really appreciative of how many different ways you do view death, and how each essay very much examines death in its own view, and like it takes a very different aspect of it. And then the essay collection as a whole, you've got these strands that just run through. So like particularly your metaphors about time and like the essays that they kept popping up in, I really liked that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to go back to what you were saying too about sort of searching for that story behind the story, I mean, that's really how it comes about. I mean, there are sort of two main, when we're writing creative nonfiction, there are kind of two main voices. There is that voice that kind of tells the surface story of what happened, like this happened to me, then this next thing happened to me. But then running along with that is this, what I call like a reflective voice, which does go deeper and it reflects upon that surface story. It sort of discovers the metaphors. And so in that way is so through the use of that voice is where I was able, say, to understand sort of the connection, say, between Adam Lambert and this Jeffrey
Mhm.
Dahmer, and just all of these other events in my life. So it's that underlying strand, that looking back strand, reflecting on your life, where you can sort of pull seemingly disparate events or people that you're writing about into a congruent whole.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with well with what you're saying because a lot of memoir is about sort of like analyzing your own experiences and seeing connections that you might not necessarily have realized were there before.
Right, and so I'm really curious, like, in your own work, sort of how that plays out, like, sort of how you have discovered sort of unexpected things and sort of what those have been, as you've been writing. I'd be really curious to know more about, like, your process in that way.
Okay, so well, my personal essays have mainly been focused on my experiences of mental health caused by brain inflammation. And I actually started writing these essays purely for therapy because they were about me processing everything that was going on and that I was experiencing. And so I did find that writing my life into this series of personal essays was extremely therapeutic. And yeah, I suppose it really did mean that I was discovering things as I was writing. Like my essays often examine my experiences of having severe OCD because I was diagnosed with severe OCD last year. And it was due to the brain inflammation that I had because the basal ganglia part of the brain, that's the part responsible for habit
Right.
formation, motor control, and emotion, among other things. That was the part that was really severely affected in my brain inflammation. So a lot of the time with my OCD, I'd just feel intense fear about something, but I'd really struggle to translate it. And cognitively, I was like quite affected with my communication because I couldn't communicate verbally. So um, I just started writing, and first it was just poetry, and those writings actually became my first poetry collection called Captive, a poetry collection on OCD, psychosis, and brain inflammation. And I have, oh yeah, I've got that book here. So that's that one. I keep forgetting where the camera is. Um, and yeah, then I just started writing really detailed personal essays where I'd really think about what I was feeling and I'd really sort of analyze it and just try to understand it more. So I was sort of like delving into my own experiences in a much more analytical way to try and process everything that was going on and work out connections I hadn't necessarily seen before. And my process of writing personal essays actually changed somewhat as I got feedback from those who'd read it. And so, like a lot of people said, that some of my personal essays had really helped them understand what OCD actually is, as there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And so that's really what drove me to write the essay entitled This Is My Brain on OCD. And that's been one of my most successful essays to date so far. It was published by Human Parts. And it's basically just an essay where I recount a day in my life and show all the things I used to be able to do, but things that now my OCD is making me afraid of. So it's like a very intimate sort of essay about my own experiences. But in that essay, I don't really sort of like delve behind it or into like the psychology of like mental illness. It's very much just focused on sort of what you can see on the surface, but then also my own feelings sort of contributing to that.
Right. Well, it's an incredibly powerful essay. I mean, for me, reading it, I felt as if I were really brought inside the experience of the OCD and what you as narrator were going through. Um, and so, and it's something like if you haven't experienced it, you don't know. But I think it's one of the real powers of creative nonfiction or personal essay is that you get to know what somebody else is experiencing, what their lives are. So I think it adds like a lot of humanity to that, to be able to
Yeah,
understand somebody
definitely.
else's experience. Um, I have a feeling that the one question that a lot of us get, maybe we should talk about that as a little bit, is sort of get our ideas from.
Um,
Do you have anything to say on that?
yeah, well, that's definitely a question I do get asked a lot. So, um, and I always find that answer is a lot easier. Well, the question's a lot easier to answer if I'm just talking about my fiction writing, because with those I have like a set sort of like thing where I know where I got my ideas from. But with my personal essays and memoir, it's very much just my own experiences. So it's just what I've experienced, and then sort of like I'll get this need to sort of like tell my story, or just to like I'll just want to like explore sort of certain themes or emotions through my writing. So like when it's all my own life, it's a bit difficult to like say where I get my ideas from, especially when it's often like asked in the context of writers wanting to know like where they can get more ideas from, because it's very specific just to me. And
Mhm.
yeah, because like writing my personal essays and memoir, it's very much just about sharing my experiences, but doing so in a way where I can either sort of like raise awareness for a neuropsychiatric disorder or engage readers and help them understand like what I'm feeling, or even just allowing me to engage in a topic or a question in a much more critical way than I'm used to. And I find it really helpful just like processing everything. So I don't have sort of like a specific answer about where I get my ideas from for personal essays, because it's very much just about what I feel I need to write at that time. So what about you? Because I know you've written multiple memoirs, so you must sort of like have a system about what inspires you to write each one.
Well, in a way, I do. I mean, I guess I would say that I write my obsessions. So whatever I'm obsessed with, and that's one thing that, anybody listening can think about. Well, what am I drawn to? What in my life am I obsessed about? And that's where those are the things I think that we want to write about. And that doesn't mean like, oh, I'm upset. I mentioned the singer Adam Lambert. Yeah, I'm obsessed about him, so I wrote about him. But I also mean it in a more global way. So that
Mhm,
the first memoir that I wrote, and that's a straight through narrative. It's not an essay collection, but it's a straight through narrative, is called Because I Remember Terror, Father, I Remember You. And that is about growing up in an incestuous family. And obviously, that's really my whole childhood. So on
mhm,
that level, I was really obsessed with that and trying to understand what it meant. And the second memoir I wrote, which is also a straight through narrative, is called Lovesick: One Woman's Journey Through Sexual Addiction. And it was about basically 28 days I spent in rehab recovering from a sex addiction and an eating disorder. Then my third book is a memoir in essay form. So that's sort of when I switched from straight through memoirs to essay collections. And it's called The Pat Boone Fan Club: My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew. Now, for those of you who are in England, you might not know who Pat Boone is, but he was kind of a 1960s pop rock star, and he was very famous back in his day. But he's also known as a very conservative Christian person. And
mhm,
so the reason why is I was obsessed with him. So this was when, I mean, the obsession was when I was really a little kid. So I am Jewish. And because my Jewish father was molesting me, I wanted this really sort of Christian conservative man to adopt me. And that Papoon also has 4 daughters, so I just wanted like to be his 5th daughter. So,
Mhm.
so this third book, Papoon Fan Club, My Life as a White Anglo-Saxon Jew, it's a very quirky kind of exploration of a search for spirituality, but it's very kind of quirky and ironic. And then this new book, How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences, is then about my obsession with death and all of the different, being a memoir and essay, all the different kind of aspects of that, how that comes into play. So it really is, in terms of either advice to other writers or just, uh, for my own process, it really is following my obsessions. Something, if I'm obsessed with something, then I have to write about it until I really understand kind of the nature of the obsession, what it means, both on that surface level, but in that deeper way that we had talked about through that voice of reflection of understanding sort of the underlying like, why am I obsessed with it? In this new book, I do explore like what was the origin of the obsession with death. And one of them is that when I was like in 3rd grade, I saw my grandfather in a casket. And, obviously after he died and I saw him in a casket and I was like in 3rd grade or so. And I couldn't figure this out. I mean, it's like time he'd been playing games with me, and all of a sudden he's in this box, and how did that happen? And it just all looked scary, and I just knew I didn't want any part of that at all. And then, the fear of death kinda deepened when much later I was sexually assaulted. And afterwards, it felt like my body had been stolen and it no longer belonged to me. And that is a form of feeling like death, after
Mhm.
something like that happens. So those are all sort of things that have been obsessing me. And as I say, the only way to kind of make sense of any of it is to write about it. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, like just building on that, when I was reading your essay collection, one of the images that stood out to me in one of the essays was where you had that paper doll, and
Oh, right.
yeah, and then like you purposely like tear its neck or something, so then it's sort of like it's like
Like
it's
wounded.
yeah, and I just thought that was so powerful because you were sort of like looking at into this like the paper doll as sort of this reflection of yourself, and you like I think there was one bit where you said that you looked at this doll and then it made you really confused about like whether you were there or not, and you've got that whole sense of identity and like trying to understand yourself through the paper doll basically, and you've got like the
Yeah.
paper doll in the paper house, and yeah, I that was one of my favorite sort of like
Oh,
images
thank
throughout
you.
the whole essay
Thank you.
collection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we do write personal essay, a lot of times it can help to sort of um, discover these sort of alter egos in
Mhm,
order to more deeply understand the self. And they're all there in our real life, but it's sort of how can we then convey them sort of metaphorically on the page so that they can represent various aspects of the self.
mhm.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so I just I'm really interested that in a lot of your writing is based on mental health and sort of I guess what I'm curious about is sort of how you decide which form to use because you've written poetry
Mhm.
and you've written fiction and like how do you decide sort of what goes into a poem or then what needs to be prose, kind of like what that process because like you're brilliant. I mean, you write like everything, fiction, poetry, nonfiction. I mean, it's really impressive. But like how does that process work? Like how are those decisions made?
Okay, well, my answer probably won't help anyone who's looking for advice on how to know with which form to go with when writing something personal, because I mainly just instinctively know which form I want to use or which form I need to use. So the poetry was something that I wrote because I couldn't communicate well at the time because I had like all this cognitive dysfunction due to brain inflammation. And I found that I couldn't communicate verbally, but I couldn't really write my fiction because I just wasn't creative in that same way. But I still needed to feel like I was still a writer because that's just a huge part of my identity. And I needed to sort of like keep that part of me close because it was a very confusing and scary time because I just didn't know what was happening. And it also took me 6 months to be diagnosed because it's a very rare type of brain inflammation. So for so long, doctors just kept telling me they didn't know what was wrong with me.
That's tough.
And yeah, it was really tough. So I started writing with poetry. Like I'd never really written poetry like before that either. So it was a very new form to me, but it really helped me. And I just found that the poetic form was really apt for like untangling the complexity of everything that I was experiencing. And I just love imagery and metaphors. So I didn't consciously think, oh, I'm going to use the poetic form to write this. I just did it. And those are just like, well, I call them therapy poems, and they were just written for me, basically, just to allow me to continue being a writer when all this stuff was going on.
Yeah, right.
And I didn't really think that anyone would ever see them. So for like nearly a year, no one actually knew that I'd written this stuff. And I was a bit sort of like embarrassed in a way about sharing it because it was just like some really dark stuff, but also some really random stuff. And I was also writing about a lot of the hallucinations that I experienced in these poems because I experienced psychosis due to the brain inflammation. And the main like manifestation of that for me was that I'd see birds everywhere flying around me. Even like when I was indoors, I had these birds that would follow me everywhere, I'd fly around me. They were wrens and magpies. And it was so real, and I can't tell the difference between a hallucination like that and when there really is a bird there. So like it like I know often when people like talk about hallucinations or like in sort of like media like films and that, like you in a film you get sort of like clear like camera angling to show that it's not actually happening. But
Hmm.
when I experienced this, I thought it was real. I had no reason to think that it wasn't. And then that sort of like made me question a lot about whether I can trust anything that I think is going on, because all that time I really thought there were birds flying around me and I was getting very distressed and I was constantly trying to catch all these birds that were in my house because like they shouldn't be in my house. And I spent hours trying to catch them, and like my family had to physically like stop me from in the end because I just wasn't sleeping because I was just saying I've just got to get all these birds out of the house. So I was able to sort of like express that and like the surreal nature of that through like this poetry. And birds are actually like a motif throughout my poetry collection.
Oh,
And yeah, so I just I needed to sort of like write about the birds in like a poetic way, just in order to process what was happening. And then with my personal essays, I just kind of knew then that it would be a personal essay and not a poem, because like my personal essays were written towards the beginning of my treatment for the brain inflammation. So I was then able to write again. And I didn't feel up to writing fiction and being creative in that sense, but I still wanted to be a writer. And I didn't want to continue doing the poetry because I found that quite draining and quite emotionally sort of like heavy. So then I turned to writing the personal essays as a way to sort of raise awareness and sort of share my experiences. And the essays are definitely written more with audience in mind. So yeah, because it's all about raising awareness and educating people about these disorders, because like so little is known about them.
yeah.
And yeah, so and like I'm also writing a full length memoir about my experiences. And like pretty early on, I knew this was something that I needed to write. And I needed the longer work out to both be able to explore the journey, like the whole journey, and examine
Exactly.
everything critically while keeping it grounded in my point of view. So yeah, with those, I kind of like knew at the start when I started writing or when I just got the initial idea, which form it would take. And like with my fiction, because like I'm much more experienced as a fiction writer because I've got 6 novels out, and with each of those there's never really a question about whether it would be a novel, because
Yeah,
that's just kind
right,
of like what I write. So
right.
it's a bit different now in a way because I'm working on my second young adult thriller, and I have decided to give the main character of that the same type of brain inflammation that I have suffered from.
Oh,
So that's sort of like the first time when I'm moving sort of like into the fiction territory, but still talking about these topics that I've only approached so far through like creative nonfiction.
Well,
So
that's really interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to sort of see how it changes or doesn't change when you're sort of fiction, when you have a fictional character
yeah,
with something that you're so aware of personally. But I'm really glad you're writing a memoir, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I think that's
thank
good
you.
because I think that, you know, I mean, I already love your personal essays, but then to have that much more space to really more fully explore it, I think will be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
So hurry up and write it.
Okay.
I'm interested too, sort of, because you write in these three genres, the idea of kind of artistic freedom and emotional freedom, kind of which which genre maybe you feel the most sort of free to express yourself in? I mean, is that something that resonates with you, that idea of freedom?
Yeah, definitely. So, well, the short answer to that is fiction is where I feel the most freedom is available for me, because that's where I can be more expressive and I can just explore my ideas in a more thorough way, really delving into emotions and without worrying what readers are going to think. Like, clearly, I'm not my fictional main character, so that gives
Right.
me much more of a sense of distance that then allows me more freedom, both emotionally and artistically. And I feel with fiction, there's also less room for judgment from others, like the really personal kind of judgment. So there's less of that when you're writing fiction than memoir because readers know that it's fiction and that
Right.
these things didn't actually happen to you. Whereas like when I'm writing memoir, I'm always like, oh, well, with the personal essays, I am sort of very aware that like people I know are going to read it and it's going to change their views on me. And I'm worried about them being treated differently. And I have actually had that happen. So that has made me a bit
Oh,
warier
interesting.
about sort of like sharing my experiences via the personal essay or via memoir. But it's also shown me that it's something that I really need to do despite sort of like this fear of judgment and fear of others' reactions. Because like on the one hand, for me, like writing memoir and personal essays, I don't find it as freeing as writing fiction. But in the way that I'm then able to process my experiences, that is sort of like freeing for the soul. So yeah, I definitely think that there's less room for judgment in fiction, but the freedom that writing memoir gives you and just like the actual process of sort of like exploring what's happened to you more and understanding it more is very freeing in itself.
Yeah, that's just so interesting. I mean, because I don't write fiction, so I can't compare that, but for me, and maybe more as the longer I go along, sort of writing creative nonfiction, I actually do find it freeing. And
Okay.
first of all, I mean, I find it freeing in maybe two ways. One is that just being able to process my own experience um, is freeing in itself. For example, growing up, say, in an incestuous family. So when that was all sort of bottled up inside of me, then I felt very trapped by it in a way. And then by writing it, it's sort of like I take that experience out of me and put it there like on a page. And so it is a matter of sort of removing, not that forget about what happened to you or anything like, but just the power that any event has over you, to take it out of you and put it out there sort of on paper. I find that freeing. But I also find it freeing to sort of claim experience in that, so growing up, it was like this family secret, like you don't talk about any of this stuff. Or when I was
Mhm.
struggling with a sex addiction, I felt so much shame about it that I would never tell anybody about it. I mean, it's just like, God, I just had enormous shame. But then after I wrote about it, the shame lessened. I mean, it really did. It was sort of like I claimed my truth. This is what happened to me. Sort of take it or leave it. Like if you're going to judge me, then you're not going to be my friend anyway. And
Yeah.
so I found just a lot of, I found it just very freeing to claim my truth. I found it freeing to sort of break those silences, both in terms of family silences, community silences, like, oh, we don't talk about this. And even like in the new book about death, I mean, death is something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Like even the words we use, like rather than say somebody died, we'll say somebody passed away to sort of make it sound maybe not as scary. But it's sort of like
Mhm.
claiming your truth. No, this is, what I'm really scared about. This is, or this is what really happened to me. So sort of breaking those silences, and of course that they can be broken in lots of different ways. I mean, I think of Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale. I mean, that's breaking a lot of, it's just such a feminist work, and it's really uh, sort of showing a lot of truths about our society, particularly where we are now, which is kind of a disaster. But
Mhm.
I do feel that just, yeah, a lot of freedom in just sort of speaking my truth and claiming who I am. And then for the most part, I mean, like the response I get from people has been beautiful. I mean, I get hundreds of emails from mainly women, but kind of thanking me for telling their story too. And you'll see when
Mhm.
you publish your memoir, the same thing is going to happen to you.
Oh.
And that's very empowering, not just for, say, the people who read the book. I mean, I think it's empowering for them to know that they're not alone, but it's also empowering for me to know that I've broken the silence and I've spoken my truth, and people will relate to that and, kind of gravitate towards me. So I actually do find a lot of freedom, where that's concerned. Kind of in conjunction with that, there are a lot of naysayers about the whole form of personal essay. Um,
Yeah.
we've been called navel gazers, the black sheep of the literary community. Just a lot of people want to sort of put down creative nonfiction, and there's just a long history of kind of these sort of naysayers and kind of essay bashers is what I call them. Um, have have you experienced that, or are you aware of that? I guess I wonder if that's as prevalent in England. It's very prevalent here in the States, and I just wonder about if you've experienced that, and sort of how you feel about that.
Um, I haven't experienced it that much here in the UK, but I have noticed that when I've told people who follow my writing that I'm now writing personal essays, they've sort of like distanced themselves a bit from it and said, "Oh, well, I'm still going to read your fiction, but I'm not interested in your essays."
Oh, wow.
And when I delved into that, it turned out it was because they thought like essays were just like boring nonfiction, but they didn't have any emotion in. And they said
Oh,
that they liked my fiction writing because of like my imagery, the emotion that I infuse into my writing and my characterization. And I was saying, well, yeah, but like my personal essays have all of this as well. And I was really having to stress to them that it's creative nonfiction,
right.
and it's written with so many different like creative literary devices. And like I guess you're still going to get like some people sort of like looking down on this form, but I guess because I had a really clear motivation in writing my personal essays and even my poetry collection, like that didn't really deter me from it, because my main goals were to raise awareness for these disorders. And so it didn't really matter to me if like my fiction readers and like my fans of my novels didn't sort of read this, because I was sort of like aiming at a different audience with these.
Right, right, and it
And
and it could be a different audience,
yeah,
but you also may sway your fiction
yeah.
fans. I have a feeling are gonna be reading your memoir.
I really hope so, because like I do sort of want to dispel this sort of belief that a lot of people have that like nonfiction can only be sort of like emotionless and boring. And I think a lot of people think that memoir is also just about embarrassing friends and family. So they're sort of like a bit edgy and a bit wary about reading it, because they're, especially if they think that they might be in the memoir themselves, they're going to be like a bit like, oh, I don't know what you've written. But um, I think memoir gives a great way of looking at the reliability of memory, like you were saying, because it is very much focused on analyzing memory. And it allows you to sort of like look at memory in terms of accuracy from a psychological point of view. And I think it's when memoirs really become analytical and not just a straightforward narrative, like that recounts events like as it happened, but when they sort of draw in examinations of looking at meaning and building connections, and and like employing all the different literary devices that make a piece creative, that like memoir and personal essays can really be seen as an art form in their own right. I mean, I loved your collection so much and all the literary devices that you employed. Like there's one essay where you've got like different like you've got like in first person, second person, and third person, like in the
Mhm.
same essay. And I just love that because like each of your essays does have a different tone as well. And all the creative devices you use really emphasize just how creative nonfiction can be. And I think that's something that a lot of people who might just sort of like dismiss personal essays and memoirs, I think it's possibly because they just don't realize what creative nonfiction is.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, writing creative nonfiction, it's not like sort of Xeroxing your life, like just this happened or this happened. It really
Mhm.
is turning your life into art, and it is an art form, and it's very metaphoric. So I mean, in that sense, to me, it's a different art form, but it's just as artistic as poetry or fiction. It just,
Definitely, yeah.
happens to be based on truth,
Mhm.
But I think that a lot of people, first of all, don't understand it, but I think it also scares a lot of people because, like back in the sort of mid '90s is when a large part of memoir sort of kind of came into its own, and a lot of it was written by women and sort of people considered other. That all of a sudden we are telling our truths, and sort of our
Mhm.
patriarchal power structure was really upset that, oh, women are talking about things that they shouldn't be talking about. So I think it got a lot of kind of blowback from that, in that basically the same you know misogynistic men we still have around were really trying to silence women.
Mhm.
And so I think that there's fear. I think so. I think people don't understand the form. I think that there's also fear around the form. And then just these people who think that, oh, we're just, navel gazing, that it isn't an art form. And they don't understand how that when we're writing about the self, yes, I'm writing about myself, but I'm also writing about larger issues that are in society. Say if it's incest or sex addiction or, fear of death or spirituality. I mean,
Mhm.
it's about me, but it's about much more than me. It is there are universal concerns that I'm writing about. So it's not navel gazing at all. I mean, it's
No.
just
Mhm.
it's sort of how the self juxtaposes with these larger issues that society is struggling with. So, it's much more of this larger political, familial, and community concerns. And I think that for people who really understand that and get that and are willing to accept it, they then sort of accept the genre. But you know, but there are a lot of people, they're just sort of literary, what I call literary reductionists, that they want to say, oh, just poetry or fiction, those are the
Mhm.
only art forms, and they just really won't accept it. And what I want to say to them is that sort of one form does not negate another form. I mean, there's room for all of us as writers. There's room
Yeah.
for people who write fiction and poetry and creative nonfiction. So, like, why would you want to dump on creative nonfiction? I mean, it doesn't make any sense even. It's just, one form doesn't negate
Exactly.
another. I know. And so, you know, the idea of just writing with a lot of emotional authenticity. I mean, that's why I think your readers of your fiction are going to like your memoir, because writing
Oh,
memoir
thank you.
is being emotionally authentic. It's putting your
Yeah.
emotions on the page and it's exploring those. And it's kind of like writing, if you write from your own wound or your own heart, you're going to touch somebody else's wound or somebody else's heart, and there's that
Mhm.
strong kind of human connection there. So, yeah, I wrote an article not too long ago. It's in Hippocampus magazine, where I just took on all of these naysayers because every now and then I get really angry about it, and I just want to, they attack our genre, and I just want to go and attack theirs. But anyway, one thing I'm curious about is, from your perspective, what do you think is one of the most important things that sort of that a personal essayist should know, kind of going into this?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'd say to really think about why you're writing, like what's motivating you, because that's also going to sort of dictate the shape of your essay in some way. Because writing to educate others is going to be very different to if you're writing to process something that you've experienced, and if you're just writing for yourself. And I think personal essays are a great way for one to process anything, but you also need to decide how much of what you write will become public. So I've written so many personal essays that I haven't shared at all, and they were written solely for me, for my benefit, like partly as therapy. And while some people might think that because I'm a writer, I should share absolutely everything I've written, I do have to
You don't
remember
have
that,
to, right?
yeah, like you do have to remember that readers aren't entitled to read absolutely everything you write. And sharing personal essays has got to be sort of like your decision and something that you only do when you're comfortable with it. And you shouldn't like let someone pressure you into sharing a personal essay that you're not yet ready to share, because it is very personal and like very closely linked to yourself. So you've got to make sure that whatever you're writing about, if you are going to share it, that you're sharing it because you actually want to, and not because you're being like pressured into sharing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mhm.
I think for me, I guess what want to maybe emphasize is that everybody does have a story to tell, and that
Yeah.
everybody's voice is important. Um, I've heard of this a lot, like, "Oh, this happened to me and nobody would care about it." And I've heard it, particularly now during the pandemic, that a lot of people are saying, "God, we have this pandemic going on. Why would anybody care about my story?" But from my viewpoint, it's like now more than ever, personal essays
Mhm.
are really crucial because, I mean, by writing them and by reading them, I think is where we kind of discover our empathy, and they also engender kind of human connection. And if there's ever a time when we've needed human connection, it's now, when, we're all
Yeah.
in our isolated little boxes here on screens. And it really is a matter of, sharing your sort of your soul and trying to touch somebody else's soul. So, this is important in a pandemic, not in a pandemic. It's just, it really is making those human connections. And so I guess two things. One is that everybody has a story. I think everybody's story is important. I think
Mhm.
everybody's voice is important and needs to be heard. And it really is a way to kind of make connections with other people and to share human experiences. So,
Yeah.
so everybody go out and write your personal essays.
Yeah. Like it is really important. And as you say, it is about um, sort of sharing human experience and making others feel that they're less alone because,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. We all have our truths, and all of our truths are important.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left now before the end of this. So, Sue, do you want to do a quick reading from your new book?
Thank you. Yes, I would love to. So I'm only going to read about maybe, 2 minutes or so. So my new book is How to Survive Death and Other Inconveniences. And earlier I mentioned that the structure in part is sort of this road trip, a kind of metaphorical road trip of collecting memories. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning, where I sort of set up the idea of this road trip. And again, I'm just on this really kind of awful industrial highway in New Jersey. Um, so I floored the accelerator of my parents' gold Plymouth Savoy. I abandoned the immaculate green lawns of Glen Rock, New Jersey, looking for action. Soft, vowely suburban teenage boys, Joey, Bruce, Howie, diminish in the rear view, as does a future that would also be diminished by starched shirtwaist dresses, primly flipped hair, ivory-soaped skin. I seek other names and places to discover and define who I am and what I want, more or less to live forever. In high school, my definition of life, of action, of forever is modest, to hurtle up and down Route 17, blaring the Supremes, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. Here, I'm free, electric, invincible. To survive death, I must be invincible, just like Route 17, where the acidic rain and lightning illuminate "Eat Here" signs atop diners. The limitless wet sky thunders my car to the pavement. Route 17 shivers intensely, embracing me in its rumbling sounds. At dusk, when the rain stops, I roll down the window and inhale a bouquet of diesel fumes. Coppery strobes of sunset reflect off car bumpers. Where else do I want to be? Nowhere is where. When streetlights and neon ignite, I, underage, sneak into bars and play foosball and pinball. I plunk spare change into the jukebox. I dance with anyone who asks. Rick, Steve, guys skulking hard-edged consonants. Camel cigarettes are tucked in the sleeves of their white t-shirts like small packets of death. But we're safe here with all the power of Route 17 keeping us alive. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I really love that because it really shows just how emotive your writing is and how strong your imagery is as well, of like all sensory language. So I
Thank
think
you.
that's a really good example of just how creative nonfiction can be.
Thank you. Thank
So,
you so much. And thank you so much for arranging this and organizing this and inviting me to talk with you. I've wanted to sort of see you in sort of as close to person as we can get these days. And it's really been lovely talking with you. So, and sharing your writing. So thank you so much.
yeah, thank you for taking part. And it's so great just talking to other writers because I always learn something new. And like part of being a writer is just wanting to constantly learn new stuff and like improve your craft. So I just find these discussions so invaluable, really.
For me as
So,
well. Yeah, no,
yeah.
I love it. So yeah, just thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, I think we'll wrap up now because we've only got a few minutes left on the ability to be live on YouTube anyway. So thank you for everyone who has watched and engaged with us. And thank you, Sue, for joining me. So I'll put in the comments or the description of this video. I'll put in some links to Sue's book and also my work as well. Yeah, so that's it really.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.